On a quiet evening in the bustling city of Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, a secret affair between a devoted Muslim wife and her father-in-law spirals out of control, leading to a chilling tragedy. The affair, which began in the shadows of family gatherings, eventually erupts into a violent confrontation, leaving one man dead and the lives of many shattered. In 2008, Samira's life appeared perfect from the outside. She was 28 years old, a devoted wife and mother of two, living in Riyadh with her husband, Faisal. Their home was modest but comfortable, reflecting the life they had built together. Faisal was a successful businessman, well known in the community, always involved in new ventures and often traveling to nearby countries for work. He provided well for Samira and their children, ensuring they never wanted for anything. Yet, despite the material comfort, there was an emotional void growing in their marriage. Samira had married Faisal when she was just 20 years old, and like many traditional marriages, it was arranged by their families. In the early years, their relationship was cordial, built on mutual respect and shared responsibilities. However, as the years passed, the warmth between them began to fade. Faisal, absorbed in his business, became increasingly distant. His absences stretched from days to weeks, and even when he was home, he was often preoccupied with work. Samira, left to manage the household, took on the role of both mother and father to their children. Though she tried to maintain her religious duties, her heart felt heavy with loneliness. Samira was a woman of deep faith, and she believed strongly in the roles assigned to her by her religion and culture. She dedicated herself to her family, ensuring that the home was always in order and her children raised with the proper values. Yet, she couldn't ignore the emptiness that settled in her heart. She longed for more than just financial security. She craved emotional connection and companionship. She would often sit alone in the evenings, wondering when Faisal might come home, her thoughts drifting back to the life they used to share before work took over everything. It was during one of these lonely periods in early 2008 that she found herself increasingly drawn to Amir, her father-in-law. Amir was a man of influence within the family, highly respected not just by his relatives but by the broader community as well. He was in his early 60s, still sharp and capable, and always had a commanding presence. Unlike Faisal, who was often too distracted to notice the subtle changes in his wife, Amir paid attention. He was aware of the growing distance between Samira and his son, though he never addressed it directly. Amir had always been kind to Samira, offering advice and wisdom during family gatherings. In his eyes, Samira was the epitome of a good wife, faithful, patient, and caring. He admired how she managed the household, even when Faisal was away for long periods. Initially, their conversations were brief, nothing out of the ordinary for family interactions. However, as time went on, the nature of their exchanges began to change. Amir would find reasons to speak to Samira more often, lingering in her presence during family events. He was always careful not to draw too much attention, but there was something unspoken between them, a connection that both of them felt but neither dared to acknowledge. In early 2010, the bond between them began to shift from familial to something more dangerous. The subtle glances exchanged during dinners became longer, their conversations more personal. Amir noticed how Samira's eyes lit up when he complimented her, how she leaned just a little closer when they spoke. Samira, feeling neglected by Faisal, found comfort in Amir's attention. It was as though he understood her in ways Faisal never did. He listened to her with patience, made her feel valued in a way she hadn't felt in years. Amir, despite his age and position in the family, was not immune to the allure of forbidden desire. He recognized Samira's vulnerability and began to manipulate the situation. He reassured her that their interactions were harmless, just conversations between a father-in-law and his daughter-in-law, but deep down, both knew that what was happening was far from innocent. By mid-2010, their meetings became more secretive. Amir would find reasons to visit Faisal's home when he knew Faisal would be away. They would meet in the quiet corners of the house, behind closed doors, always careful not to be seen by the children or any family members. The moments they shared were filled with tension, each encounter leaving Samira feeling torn between her guilt and the intense emotions. She felt for air each time. She promised herself it would be the last, but the temptation grew stronger with every secret meeting. Samira's face made the situation even more complex. She knew what she was doing was wrong, a violation of everything she had been taught to value. Yet the loneliness she felt and the connection she shared with Amir overpowered her religious convictions. She would spend nights awake praying for strength, asking for forgiveness, yet the cycle of temptation continued. As the months passed, their encounters became more reckless. They began meeting in riskier locations, quiet parks at dusk or the deserted areas of the family estate. They convinced themselves that their secret was safe, that no one could ever know. But the truth was they had grown blind to the warning signs. Samira's behavior was changing, and though she tried to keep up the appearance of a devoted wife and mother, the strain of living a double life was becoming too much. Fizzle, though often absent, began to notice the shift. Samira was more withdrawn. Her conversations with him became brief and cold. He chalked it up to the stress of managing the household, but a lingering doubt crept into his mind. He began watching her more closely, sensing that something was amiss, though he couldn't quite place what it was. By late 2011, rumors within the family started to surface. Fizzle's younger sister had noticed the way Amir and Samira exchanged glances during family gatherings. She mentioned it to Fizzle, who dismissed her concerns at first, but the seed of doubt had been planted. As the year drew to a close, the tension between Samira and Fizzle reached its peak. He began to suspect that there was more going on behind the scenes, but he couldn't bring himself to confront it head-on, at least not yet. By early 2012, the situation had become unbearable. Samira, caught between her guilt and her emotions, found herself spiraling deeper into a web of lies. Every interaction with Amir felt like walking a tightrope, knowing that one misstep could lead to disaster. Little did she know the disaster was already in motion, and soon everything would unravel in the most tragic way. The affair, once a secret shared between two people, had now become a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. By the summer of 2012, the weight of the affair had begun to take its toll on Samira. She found herself growing increasingly distant from her husband. What started as guilt turned into avoidance. She struggled to meet his eyes, knowing that every moment spent with him was now filled with deceit. Fizzle, though often absent, noticed these subtle shifts in her behavior. Samira, once so attentive and engaged in their conversations, now seemed distracted, her thoughts always elsewhere. The warmth she once showed him, even during his long absences, had slowly evaporated. Fizzle's suspicions began to grow, but at first, he tried to dismiss them. After all, they had been married for over a decade, and he had always trusted Samira completely. But it was impossible to ignore the way she had become more withdrawn. Her presence in the house was now merely routine. She no longer shared the small details of her day with him, no longer waited eagerly for him to return home from his business trips. Instead, she seemed preoccupied, avoiding meaningful conversations, often retreating to their bedroom early under the guise of exhaustion. Fizzle initially attributed this to the stress of managing the household and raising their two children largely on her own. He told himself that his constant work trips had perhaps strained their relationship and maybe Samira simply needed more support. But as the weeks passed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was wrong. Amir, on the other hand, had become more brazen in his interactions with Samira. The secrecy that once cloaked their affair had given way to a reckless boldness. He found more opportunities to be alone with her, taking advantage of any time Faisal was away. Family gatherings became tense for Samira as she navigated the ever-growing web of lies she was spinning. Amir, however, appeared unfazed, emboldened by the belief that no one would ever suspect him. By late 2012, Samira's behavior had become impossible to ignore. Faisal, now fully alert to the changes in his wife, began to observe her more closely. He noticed how she avoided physical contact with him, how her laughter seemed forced during family meals, and how she no longer looked him in the eye when they spoke. There were moments when Faisal would find Samira lost in thought, staring out of the window as if she were miles away, disconnected from the life they shared. In late 2013, rumors began to swirl within the family. Faisal's younger sister, Aisha, who had always been close to him, had long sensed that something was amiss between Samira and Amir. During a family dinner one evening, she overheard a hushed conversation between them. It wasn't just the words that caught her attention, but the tone, the way Amir spoke to Samira, the way she responded with a softness that Aisha had never seen before. It sent a chill down her spine. Though she didn't have concrete evidence, Aisha knew something was wrong. Later that evening, she approached Faisal, expressing her concerns. At first, Faisal dismissed her worries, unwilling to believe that anything inappropriate could be happening between his wife and his father. But Aisha's words lingered in his mind. Over the next few weeks, he began to observe more closely, taking note of how often Samira and Amir seemed to disappear during family gatherings. Small, seemingly innocent moments that he had once overlooked now felt charged with hidden meaning. By February 2014, Faisal's suspicions had grown too large to ignore. He began quietly monitoring Samira's movements, watching her closely without letting on that he was aware. He noticed how she would often leave the house under the pretense of running errands, how her phone seemed to be more closely guarded than before. There were moments when he would catch her speaking softly on the phone, abruptly ending the conversation when he entered the room. Faisal felt a deep sense of betrayal growing within him, but he remained silent, biding his time. He knew that he couldn't confront her without proof. His heart grew heavy with each passing day, torn between the love he had always held for his wife and the growing certainty that she was keeping a dark secret from him. The emotional distance between them had become unbearable, but still, Faisal waited, hoping against hope that he was wrong. It was in the middle of February 2014 that Faisal finally uncovered the truth. One evening, while Samira was out, he went through her phone. What he found shattered him. Messages exchanged between Samira and Amir, once hidden away, now lay bare before him. The words were unmistakable. There was no room for doubt. His wife and his father had been carrying on an affair behind his back for years. The realization hit him like a tidal wave, drowning him in a sea of anger and despair. Faisal sat in silence, the weight of his discovery pressing down on him. He felt as though the world had shifted beneath his feet, as though everything he had known about his life had been a lie. Yet even in his rage, he didn't confront Samira immediately. He waited, simmering in his anger, allowing the truth to settle within him. He would confront them, but he would do it on his own terms. The emotional connection that once held his marriage together was now severed, replaced by a dark, festering anger. Faisal knew that nothing would ever be the same again, but he remained silent, waiting for the moment when he could unleash the full weight of his fury on both Samira and Amir. What had once been a peaceful home was now a ticking time bomb, and it was only a matter of time before everything exploded. What would Faisal do with this knowledge? What drastic turn of events would unfold next? The tension within him grew unbearable, his thoughts consumed by the betrayal that had shattered his life. The emotional ties between him and his father, once strong, had now turned into a burning hatred, while the love he had for his wife had been replaced by bitterness. All that remained was the waiting, the calm before the storm. On the evening of March 6, 2014, the quiet of Faisal and Samira's home was interrupted by an event that would change the course of their lives forever. Faisal, returning unexpectedly early from a business trip, stepped into the house just after sunset. The air inside felt thick with tension, but he had grown used to this feeling in recent months. His suspicions, long brewing, were always with him, never allowing him to feel at ease in his own home. As he sat down his briefcase, Faisal noticed the silence. The children were staying at his sister's house for the night, but the house wasn't entirely empty. He could hear muffled voices coming from the guest room, a room normally reserved for his father during visits. Faisal's heart began to race, the doubts that had plagued him for so long now boiling to the surface. He moved silently toward the door, listening as the soft voices became clearer. His mind raced with possibilities, but deep down, he already knew what he was about to discover. When he reached the door, it was slightly ajar. He peered inside, his breath catching in his throat as the scene unfolded before him. His wife Samira and his father Amir locked in an intimate embrace. Time seemed to stand still for a moment. Faisal's worst fears, the suspicions that had eaten away at him for months, were confirmed in the most devastating way possible. The betrayal of not just his wife but his own father cut through him like a knife. Faisal's body reacted before his mind could catch up. A wave of uncontrollable rage washed over him as he burst through the door, confronting them. His voice, once calm and measured, was now filled with fury. The sight of Amir, the man who had raised him, entwined with his wife was more than he could bear. His mind became a blur, consumed by thoughts of betrayal and humiliation. Samira recoiled in shock, her face pale as she tried to explain, but her words were lost in the storm of Faisal's anger. The confrontation quickly escalated. Faisal's world had come crashing down, and there was no controlling the rage that had taken hold of him. His emotions, once bottled up, now spilled out in a torrent of violence. He reached for the nearest object, a decorative knife that had been hanging on the wall for years. Its presence, once a symbol of family heritage, was now a weapon of destruction. Without thinking, Faisal lunged at Amir, stabbing him repeatedly. Each thrust of the knife was driven by the pain of betrayal, each strike a release of the pent-up anger that had been building for so long. Amir, once a figure of strength and authority in the family, crumpled to the floor under the force of his son's attack. Blood quickly pooled around him, staining the carpet beneath his body. Once full of life and power, Amir now lay lifeless at his son's feet. The room, once a place of family gatherings, had become the scene of a brutal crime. Samira, frozen in shock, could only watch as her world fell apart. Her scream echoed through the house, but Fizzle barely heard it. His mind was consumed by the enormity of what he had done. He turned to her, his anger still burning, but before he could act, the weight of his actions overwhelmed him. His body, exhausted by the violence and the emotions swirling within him, collapsed to the floor. The knife slipped from his hand, clattering onto the blood-soaked ground beside him. The aftermath was a blur. A neighbor, having heard the commotion, called the police, unaware of the tragedy unfolding inside. The police arrived within minutes, their flashing lights casting an eerie glow over the quiet street. They entered the house cautiously, unsure of what to expect. Inside, they found Fizzle on the floor, covered in his father's blood, his face drained of emotion. Amir's lifeless body lay beside him, and Samira, still in shock, sat motionless in the corner of the room. On March 8th, Fizzle was taken into custody. The news of the murder sent fear through the community. Fizzle, once a respected businessman and family man, was now the subject of scandal and whispers. His father's murder, committed in a fit of rage, was the talk of the town, but the real scandal lay in the details of the affair that had led to it. As Fizzle sat in his cell awaiting the next steps in the investigation, Samira was left to face the consequences of her own actions. She was questioned by the authorities. Her role in the affair was now exposed for all to see. In the weeks that followed, the investigation unfolded in painstaking detail. The police pieced together the events leading up to the murder, interviewing family members, neighbors, and colleagues. By March 20th, the evidence against Fizzle was overwhelming, and he was officially charged with the murder of his father. The weight of his actions hung heavily over him, but his anger had not entirely subsided. In his mind, the true blame lay with Samira and Amir, the people who had betrayed him in the most intimate way possible. As the case went to trial, the courtroom became a battleground of emotions. The details of the affair were laid bare for all to see, shocking the community and tarnishing the family's once respected reputation. Fizzle, though guilty of murder, was seen as a man who had been pushed to his breaking point. His pleas for leniency under Sharia law were heard, and the court, recognizing the emotional torment that had driven him to commit the crime, showed him mercy. His sentence was reduced to 15 years in prison, a punishment that reflected both the gravity of the crime and the understanding of the pain that had led to it. But Samira's fate was far more severe. In the eyes of the court, she was the true cause of the tragedy. Her role in the affair, her betrayal of both her husband and the family, was seen as the root of the violence that had unfolded. Initially sentenced to death for her part in the scandal, Samira's life was spared only by Fizzle's plea for mercy. Though he had every reason to hate her, he could not bring himself to condemn her to death. The court, moved by his plea, reduced her sentence to 10 years in prison. Despite this act of mercy, their marriage was irreparably broken. The bond they had once shared, fragile as it had been, was now completely shattered. Samira's reputation, once that of a dutiful wife and mother, was forever tarnished. The community, once supportive of the family, now turned its back on her, viewing her as the catalyst for the tragedy that had destroyed not just one life, but an entire family. The family, once a pillar of the community, was left in ruins. Amir's death, the affair, and the murder had torn them apart, leaving scars that would never heal. Fizzle, though spared the death penalty, would live the rest of his life with the weight of his actions hanging over him. Samira, too, would carry the burden of her choices, locked away from the world, her children, and the life she had once known. In the end, the story of their lives became a cautionary tale, a warning of the destructive power of betrayal, desire, and unchecked rage. What had once been a family bound by tradition and respect was now nothing more than a memory, broken beyond repair. The tragedy that had unfolded on the evening of March 6, 2014, would haunt them for the rest of their days. By the end of 2015, Samira was left to reflect on the choices that led to the destruction of her family. The weight of her guilt was matched only by the isolation she now faced, as both her husband and father-in-law were gone. The marriage, once a bond forged in tradition, was now nothing but a memory, shattered by betrayal and bloodshed. What will become of Samira? Will she ever find redemption in the eyes of her community, or is she forever marked by the sins of her past? Like the case where the Muslim wife's secret affair with her husband's cousin ended in murder, this case was marked by shame and regret. Don't forget to like our videos and subscribe as you go through our cases.